Hello and welcome everyone to Creating Patterns of Possibility. This is the third in a series of webinars held by the Rockwell Foundation System Innovation Initiative, in which we will be diving into different aspects of what it means to take deliberate, practical action to create the systems we need to meet the challenges of our times. And a big welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today, and to those of you who have joined us before. In this series, we're building on some of the frameworks we set out in our first green paper on system innovation called Building Better Systems. And you'll be receiving new articles from us before each session on different aspects of system innovation, which we'll be digging into with our guests who all have hands-on experience themselves of the everyday work of creating different, better systems. And also with you, our audience. So we know that you're coming from many different countries, many different positions. We're really glad to have you joining us here today. And in today's session, we're looking at relationships and how changing the pattern of relationships in a system can drive very different outcomes. My name is Janne Koefoed. I am the Director of Social Innovation here at the Rockwell Foundation. And together with my colleague, Charlie Ledbeater, we'll be hosting today's session. So Charlie is in London. I'm sitting here in Copenhagen. We have Johannes Björkman behind the scenes, who many of you will have been in contact with. And we also have Johanna on the chat. So they are in fact different people, along with our colleague, Ida, and Noah on tech support, who's actually sitting in the Lofoten Islands at the moment. And today we have 4 guests who'll join us on screen shortly. Nat Whally set up the online platform Organise in 2017 in response to the decline in worker power, worker voice in the context of precarious work and the Me Too movement. She joins us from the UK, where Organise is helping over 1.5 million workers to come together anonymously around issues that matter to them, giving them safety in numbers to push for change in their workplaces, and supporting employers to become more responsive to the realities faced by their employees and their everyday working lives. We have Gorka Espiau joining us from the Basque region of Spain, where he leads the Agir Centre for Social and Political Studies, which was set up to share lessons from the really remarkable transformation the Basque region went through during the peace movement. And Gorka is a long-time pioneer of an approach to system change based on deep listening and the integration of culture, narrative, values as the foundation for community transformation. And the Agir Centre supports communities across the Basque country to navigate big transitions such as the shift to a green economy while staying true to their deep cooperative history. Janne Koefoed is here with us in Denmark. In fact, she's sitting in the foundation with us today, where she's set up the Front Runner Network, which is a network of municipalities working together to tackle the kinds of systemic challenges that cut across boundaries and need a holistic response. And the members of Jan's network are actually the first group of free municipalities in Denmark who've been given special dispensation to rip up the rule book and work differently. And they're collaborating with citizens across the country to pioneer new approaches to welfare challenges and to open up new kinds of public value. And rounding us off, we'll have Ben Ramalingam. And Ben, if you were sitting here with us in Denmark, we would say that you're the raisin in the sausage, which is one of those glorious Danish phrases that sounds much worse than it actually is. It means you're the juicy bit at the end that everybody's looking forward to. So Ben was named Humanitarian Changemaker of the Decade in 2020 for being one of 10 people globally to have done the most to improve international crisis responses. And Ben spent most of his career working with networks and alliances for change, helping to set up and evaluate their performance in many different contexts, from global health to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ben's most recent book, Aid on the Edge of Chaos, is about the value of systems thinking for international cooperation. And he also has a new book coming out called Upshift, which looks at innovation and creativity under conditions of stress and pressure. So Ben is here bringing his experience of leading the UK's Humanitarian Innovation Hub, which is a new investment program to address the biggest challenges in global crisis response. So we have entrepreneurs, conveners, insiders, and investors. And the way that this will work is that we'll hear from Charlie, who will take us through some of the different ways in which relational patterns define systems. Charlie will then ask Nat, Gorka, Janne, and Ben to respond with some of their own experiences. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion and turn it over to you, our audience, for your questions before we close. And we close at hour today, so slightly longer than usual. A few housekeeping notes. We are live, so you can expect some glitches. The session will be recorded and we'll make it available to you afterwards. And you're welcome to use the chat function throughout, but if there is a question you particularly want to ask, please put it in the Q&A box. We'll be picking up questions from there. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag system innovation. And if any of you missed the article we circulated before today, the link is in the chat. But to get us started, I'm just going to switch over to this overhead camera for a quick look at why we are interested in systems as a means, relationships as a means of shifting systems. So many people around the world think there are big systemic challenges to which systems are struggling to respond, whether that's to do with mental health, a green transition, an aging population, systemic injustice. And I think we're all here together because we're interested in the question of how to deliberately act on systems and innovate. So who can bring about deliberate change and how can they do it? And at the Rockwell Foundation, we're particularly interested in that practical knowledge. So combining what it is we can learn from theory and history about how systems have changed in the past and what we can learn from people like Nat, Gorka, Janne, and Ben, who are working to change systems now. And we're not just interested in how it is that you can fix existing systems, though that, of course, is a big challenge in many places. We're also interested in opportunity. So how can you open up new types of systems that could generate different, better outcomes in society? How is it that we can bring those new kinds of systems into being? That's what we want to look at with you in this series. And when we look at how systems have changed in the past, we can see that there is a shift in some combination of four things. So purpose, what the system is for, the assumptions it's built on that drive how it carries out its mission, power, who has it, how is it distributed to power the system, the way that resources flow, whether that's people or information, money or assets, and the way that relationships are configured to meet that new purpose. So a shift in the relational architecture, if you like, that enables a new pattern of activities. We call these the four keys that unlock system innovation. And we can see them in action if you look at how our health systems have evolved over the last 15, 20 years. So we have a modern health system that has grown up around the purpose of treating acute conditions using the power of professionals and medical expertise. It's mostly organized through hierarchies of hospitals, treatment units, and it depends on high-tech equipment and medication. And there are lots of real advances going on here that's making this system more efficient, more effective. We saw the power of this system in the vaccination rollout during the pandemic. But over the last few decades, in many countries, we've also had to grow a related and parallel system that supports people to live well with chronic health conditions and prevent lifestyle diseases in their own everyday lives. So that is a very different kind of purpose. And actually it needs a different kind of relational architecture because it relies on the power of people themselves in their communities, making changes in their lives and taking care of each other. And it relies on distributing the resources to do so, so the tools and the knowledge, through very different network of relationships in society that includes workplaces, neighborhoods, families, and peers. And of course, all of that needs funded, measured, co-produced, orchestrated in fundamentally different ways. So that really is a new system that's grown up alongside our existing system, involving different actors in a different pattern of relationships that's now becoming more and more integrated. So in many of the challenges we face, like chronic disease, there is an existing system in which purpose, power, resources and relationships are locked together in a particular pattern that's not suitable to meet that new purpose. And we need to unlock them to get change moving. So you can start anywhere, but today we're looking at relationships because we think that how you design the pattern of relationships that drives the system can unlock power and resources in new ways. So if, like me, some of you are old enough to remember what life was like before we had things like Airbnb, Spotify, ride sharing, you will remember that there was a period of huge innovation in our systems when ideas about sharing rather than ownership, peer-to-peer expertise, democratizing innovation was coming together with new Web 2.0 technologies and really sweeping through whole industries like music and content creation, hospitality, software, changing how they worked. And those system innovations were based on a new relational architecture, and one that was networked, distributed, open, had very low barriers to entry, and was all about co-production. And in many cases, these were very different patterns that changed how power operated and how resources were produced and shared. And these patterns made it possible to value something different. So for example, the honeybee network in India that enables grassroots innovators in the farming community to share and build on traditional knowledge really elevated the value of traditional knowledge. And of course, these patterns started to make their way into health systems as a way of building up peer power around self-care and lifestyle change, collaborative data on symptom management, new forms of social care. I think the Recovery Colleges network is a really good example of a response to mental health that really foregrounds peer experience. So if we start to look at how innovators are shaping the patterns of relationships and systems, we do see these same patterns show up in very different contexts. So the cellular pattern of organization that's behind Al-Qaeda is also behind the fastest growing church in the US and behind new innovations in social care like the Bertzog cooperative in Holland. And of course, many of these are much older ideas given new forms through technology. Denmark, of course, has a long history of very successful cooperative models, which we now see coming out in new forms through Web3 and the platform co-op movement. So it's really these different kinds of architectures that we're talking about when we're looking at relationships. And I know that there are many examples of innovators in our audience today who are working to shift those patterns. So I think we might have Anne Sørensen from Hjem til Al, or Homes for All, that builds the relationships needed to act collectively on homelessness in Denmark, and also Ginny Cooper at the Homelessness Network in Scotland. I can see that we've got a few people from the MasterCard Foundation in Kenya and Senegal who are building the relational infrastructure between young people and the business community as routes into work and entrepreneurship. We've got Tracy Robertson from the Trillium Foundation in Canada, who I know has been long building relationships for resilient communities. And Sophie Budke and her team at the Ministry for Social Care here in Denmark, who are investing in new kinds of systems for care. And too many more really to cover at the beginning of this session. So I'll turn it now over to Charlie, who will take us through some different ways in which system innovators work with relationships.
Jenny, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming. I'm based in London, but just to show my allegiance to my Danish host, you can see my little Danish flag over there. And I can't really start a session with Rockwool without lighting my candle. So I'll do that, and I'll just put my candle up by my flag, just to show you that this is really Danish. And like many of you, I suppose, I've been all of my thinking about this has been overshadowed by what's happening in Ukraine. And so I decided today would be the day that I donate to the Disaster Emergency Committee appeal on Ukraine. And I thought, how will I work out how much to donate? What's the right amount? So I thought I'll donate £1 for everyone who we attract to our seminar. So later I'll donate £178. So even if you get nothing from this seminar at all, your participation will have sent £1 to help people in Ukraine. So systems, many ways to think about them, but systems bring together, as Jenny said, systems bring together people, resources, assets in different ways repeatedly to achieve outcomes. And it's the way that those things come together that defines the patterns of those relationships and interactions, that defines the character of the system. So if you want to change a system, or you want to create a new system, you have to change those patterns. And so the question is, well, how does that happen? So what I'm going to do with my little overhead camera here is just tell you one story about a city that did that, and then give you two models for thinking about how they did it and what that all involves. So I hope you can see all of that clearly. And this is a story that comes from the city of Curitiba in Brazil, well known as a home for social innovation and social entrepreneurship, particularly under the leadership of Jamie Lerner, its former mayor. And this story starts with the challenge that cities like Curitiba face, which is the constant growth of favelas and informal settlements as people come to the city. And these are in many ways very intimate and communal, but they also create all sorts of side effects, poorer health, inequality, poor sanitation, poor education often, and they're prey to other kinds of problems. And so faced with the growth of one of these favelas in a place called Cujuru, the city decided that it would go to the Interdevelopment Bank of America and get some money, quite a substantial sum, and they would work with the bank and builders and architects to design a better solution. And so they did, and what soon started happening was that the bank said that they had to work with registered builders, and the registered builders said that they had to work in a standardized way to create standardized units, and these cost about $10,000 per unit. And pretty soon, these sort of barrack blocks were going up across Cujuru as an alternative to the favela. And the city called a halt to it and said, look, this is ridiculous. A, this is very expensive. B, we'll end up maintaining all this. C, they're all standardized and they look like a barracks block. People are going to hate it. We've got a different solution. And so the solution that Curitiba offered was, what if we, the city, support the people of the community to design and build their own homes? And if we do that using their resources and imagination with our underpinning of the whole process, then actually each home will cost about $3,000. And they'll look after them. So we won't have the long-term requirement. They'll all be different. It will create a sense of belonging and community, and actually it will generate much better outcomes. So it's a combination of sort of self-help, community help, state support, government support, creating a framework for that to emerge. So what happened in Curitiba then was that thousands upon thousands of these self-build homes were built, and about 120,000 people now live in that community in entirely self-built homes built with the support of the state. And it's a much better solution than either the standardized solution that was being proposed by the bank or the pure bottom-up solution of the favela. So you saw a sort of transition between these three different kind of relational patterns. One very communal, but ineffective in many ways and prone to going downhill. one very standardized and top down, efficient in a kind of way, but very costly actually, and one which was a sort of orchestrated process of self-help. So that's a relational architecture shift, going through these three different kinds of patterns. So what is it that Curitiba did in that process, and how could we understand it so that we might apply some of those lessons elsewhere? So one way to think about it is that all systems innovation is working with a small set of patterns of organization and patterns of systems, these relational patterns. And one is a hierarchical pattern, which is shaped by authority. So what you do in this is you look for instructions from a higher authority about what you do. A second is to organize things around a sense of community. And in this, what you do is you look to your peers and your friends and your colleagues as a guide to action. So what you do is constrained and organized around what is good for those lateral mutual relationships. And then thirdly, you could imagine a sort of market-based approach where what you do is what's in your self-interest. You choose what's best for you. And in some way, these three, self-interest in the market, community and mutuality, authority and hierarchy, create a space. And it's in that space that different kinds of solutions can develop. So we think one of the first things that systems innovators do is often when it appears that the system is dominated just by one of these things, they open it up and they create a much larger possible space of solutions. And they open up the imagination of people in and outside the system of what could happen. And the interesting spaces are never just in one of these places. The interesting solutions aren't ever just usually on the line between them. They're in this space in the middle here. And what you find in that space are things like network solutions, which can work with hierarchies. Networks and hierarchies work together. Markets and networks often work together. Community and networks work together. Networks work on lateral flows of information, advice, resources, mobilization, authority. And you can find networks which can be more over here or more down here or more over here towards community, but networks sort of operate in that middle space. The kind of platforms that Jenny was talking about earlier, Airbnb, open source platforms, Wikipedia in a kind of way, you can imagine those being both quite market-based. I mean, you can imagine, obviously, platforms like Amazon and Apple and what have you being quite a strong combination of hierarchy and market with a limited amount of community. You can also imagine them being much more community-based, much more open source, mutual, and so on and so forth. And then in combination with that, obviously now, the design of all of these systems will be heavily influenced by their need to become circular and regenerative rather than linear and throughput systems. So what we think systems innovators do is open up this space. They open up the space between hierarchy, market, and community, and they find new combinations of things like platforms and networks and circular systems that might operate in that kind of space. So how do they do that? Well, we think that there are sort of three big entry points into that which matter. The first is, which I think will come out from some of our participants in the panel, is that timing is important. Both the preparation for the moment when a system becomes open to change, but also capitalizing on moments of flux when systems and relationships are more open than they were before. And we all know from our own lives that there are times in our lives when we're probably more open to new relationships than other times. And so capitalizing on timing and understanding timing, we think is quite important to that. not too late, not too early, when things are in flux and fluid. We think that there's something very important about the who, and particularly about the role of conveners in doing a couple of things. One is opening up the boundaries of systems to allow in new players. And secondly, allowing those relationships to form in a system in a quite egalitarian and open way. So the who of systems change is about creating greater diversity in this space and ensuring relationships of relative equality rather than structures of power that they will have come from. And so that these spaces that people work in, convened in interesting ways by these system conveners, then have very important qualities. And the final thing is the where. So it's when, who, and where. And we think that systems innovators are very good, very adept at, first of all, finding points of productive stress where there are stress points from many different positions in a system. So many people, workers, clients, politicians, funders, are feeling stressed. So there are multiple stress points, but there are also permissive spaces in which new models for relationships can be possible. And those permissive spaces allow a change in the relational architecture to come about so that people can almost experiment with new kinds of relationships. So we think that what systems innovators are very good at doing is exploiting the opportunities of the right time to then bring together people in new kinds of ways, in permissive spaces, which allow them to find new relational architectures. And that creates, if it's going to create change, that creates better outcomes in the long run. So one way of thinking about what might be going on here is that you've almost got two overlapping triangles. You've got the opportunities created by the space opened up between hierarchy, market, and community. And in this space here is where the opportunities lie to create new kinds of relationships. And then in a way, you've got where people operate, who they bring in, and finding the right time. And that creates a sort of almost like an overlapping triangle like that. So if you can operate, find the right time when a system is open, you can bring together the right people in a more diverse kind of way, and you can create new models of more permissive relationships, then you can get new relational architectures developing in those spaces. And you can shift patterns of power and purpose, and you can create those new relational architectures. And out of that, hopefully, you can turn vicious and negative cycles, the kind of cycles that were setting in that favela, into positive and virtuous cycles. You change the relational dynamic of the system. And by doing that, you also enhance learning across the system. So that's what we broadly think systems innovators do in changing the relational architectures of the system. They open up the space between hierarchy, market, and community. That creates a much wider possibility space in the middle here. They're adept at bringing people together, opening up the boundaries of the system, creating new permissive spaces where people can model new relationships, and doing that at a time when the system is particularly open to change. And that then can create this enhanced learning across the system, which turns vicious cycles, negative cycles, into positive ones. So that, in short, is the theory. So I hope that was reasonably clear. And now to turn over to the practice, I want to come to our panel of great speakers and contributors and start with Janne from the Frontrunner Network. So Janne, you're working with municipalities in Denmark. Talk about the kind of change that you're trying to bring about in the relationship between citizens and public services, and the new kind of relationships that you're trying to enable there.
Yeah, we have, as you know, here in Denmark, we have this very well-developed welfare system. And kind of a backflip from that is that when you have people that don't fit into our boxes, we have a problem. We don't know how to deal with them. And that is what we're trying to do here. So traditionally, we ask people to prove their flaws or their disabilities, or how malfunctions they are, to put them into the right box of what they have the right to gain from the system. And what we're trying to do instead is to ask people what's motivating you, and how can we work with you to kind of help you in the right direction for your own dreams and what you want to gain with your life. So that is that.
But that's not a relationship with clients or citizens that public service workers are used to, right? And it's not the relationship the system is set up to enable. So how do you get this wider system to respond in that different kind of way?
Well, it's been a long journey, and we worked for this to try to solve this for many years. And what we figured out, there are so many structures that are actually in our way to get here. There's of course all the systems and the leaderships and the need of control and the legislations and everything is built up to another regime and what we are trying to do. So we in the same way we work with the individual citizen to try to help them, and then we work with the system itself and try to do like a 360 view of the citizens and his or her problems, and do the same with the municipality, and do actually the same with the whole system and all the relations, the actors that are in the whole system that are have an influence on the meeting between the citizen and the workers of the municipality.
Because I'm guessing it would be very easy in those meetings then just to think, oh, we just need to respond to this in a different way. But you're inviting the system to try and rethink the way it relates with itself as well as with citizens, and to see the whole of those relationships as being part of what happens with the citizen.
Yeah, often I'm asked, is this just a cultural problem in the municipality? And it is a cultural problem, but it's a culture of the whole system. So we need to look at the whole system to come around to find the sustainable solutions in this. Otherwise, it's always, then it's too hard. It's always a struggle to get there. So we need to change the whole system, and we need to make a greater mental transition with the whole system, with the politicians, the central government, the municipality leaders and politicians, and the people that work with the citizen and the citizen themselves.
So actually what you're talking about then, Janne, as a kind of change is quite a deep change, because it's about mental models and culture, but it's also quite a pervasive change. It needs, it's not just in social workers, and it's not just in social worker managers, it's in a wider set of conditions which affect their work and what have you. So that would imply, I guess, that to bring about change, you need quite a lot of momentum across quite a large number of players. It's not about reform, it's about creating a kind of coalition or movement for change, right?
Yeah, and that's why we've come together from 16 to 20. We worked with the free community policy experiment. It was 9 community policies that worked together to try to have bigger muscles to do this and a bigger voice in the national arena and so on. And now when we came to an end on the experiment, they were not done with this journey, and some of them decided to keep on working together, and it makes a lot of sense. And what I do is working with the community policies, and then I work with what do you call lobbyism, drink a lot of coffee with all the decision makers and where the power is and all this. So yeah. But
you sound as if you might be like one of these system conveners in a way. If I'm honest, that you're trying to create new relationships and new ways for people to model those relationships. So at that point, Janne, stay with us. If you've got any questions, by the way, please do put them in the Q&A function or in the chat. We are keeping a check of that, and Jenny will come back later with them. But Gorka, I'd like to bring you in here, because you also, your work is really all about where does the power to change across society come from, and how do you generate that? And where we ended that little conversation with Janne there, which is about the importance of creating these sort of sense of movement and coalition, central to your work as well. Tell us how that has developed in the Basque region and how it emerged, this approach to change emerged out of peace building.
Well, thank you for the invitation again. Really interesting. I guess that because I was personally involved in the human rights movement for a long time has conditioned all of the work we do. But what we try to better understand how the Basque society have been able to conduct this really large-scale transition from a place where the end of dictatorship, industrial collapse, violence, etc., was concentrated in the area, to current situation where, in terms of sustainable human development, we have a similar indicators that you could find in Denmark, for example. So there were a lot of analysis about this, but from single aspects of the equation, like understanding the economic development or understanding the social or the human rights measure. But there was not real systems interpretation or how these elements were connected to each other. So we've been conducting a lot of research really to better understand how the peace movement or the cooperative movement or the gastronomic scene actually have been connected or not. And what we discovered was that when you ask the people and the organizations that have been leading these transformations, they were all telling a similar story about what was going on, about what was motivating them, and why they were taking very strange decisions if you were looking from the outside. So then we realized that it was much more useful to apply a movement lens to understand what had happened. So actually, it was a movement of transformation taking place without all these actors realizing that they were part of a movement. They were conducting very different things, but they were telling the same story. So since then we've been trying to really deconstruct this process, because we feel that there is something wrong about how the innovation spiral that we all have in our minds about how innovation takes place when you see this like larger scale transformation taking place. In the traditional innovation spiral, I would argue that everything is more transactional and not so much relational. It's like if you do this, you will get this here. So you do this to get that. But actually, when we see all this, the most interesting transformations, the logic, I think it is much more interesting to see it, how are these things moving in the same direction without having anyone controlling it? Because the moment you try to control it, it doesn't work anymore. And within that movement, as you were explaining, you can see organizations and initiatives with different, very different structures. They can be hierarchical, they can be more market-oriented, or they can be community-driven, but they are kind of moving in the same direction. So since that's what we are doing, is we are experimenting with this type of larger scale transformations that really invest much more time in listening to what are the stories that these people and organizations are telling about what is going on, what is possible, what are the main challenges, and what happens if things change. What are those power dynamics that you were also mentioning? And from that deeper listening approach, we can, I think, conduct better sense-making exercises and really in a longer period of times, where actually generate that deliberation infrastructure that we saw during the peace process here in the Basque Country, and where really those relations change. So in our experience, I mean, those relations change obviously through practice, but more profoundly only when people feel that they have been listened to, and there is no one is trying to force how you change your position or your attitude, but actually generating that deliberation space where you naturally, as a human being, try to connect with the part of the truth that you recognize in others' positions. So I think this is for us the great question now: how we can build better and more deliberation spaces or sense-making spaces that are connected with co-creation and prototyping in larger scale, so whole systems can be transformed.
So paying attention to a longer period of relationship building to build understanding and trust gets you to a very different kind of process of prototyping, generating, creating. But if you try and short circuit that process, make it too goal driven or too instrumental, I suppose, then it doesn't work. That seems to be the message. So I suppose my question would be: so how do you go from building these more egalitarian relationships between a wider number of players into action? How does it stop? How do you avoid it just becoming a talking shop?
Yes. Well, I don't know. So I think we are all trying to experiment or learn how this can be really done in larger scale formats. But what has been very interesting is starting the conversation from analyzing what is actually happening, what we can call the portfolio of actions that are taking place in a particular place or a particular theme, and then listen more deeply into what are the motivations of those actors, if they are aligned or not, without really trying to educate the system. So because we have seen a lot of efforts, especially in the innovation, social innovation and design world, that use co-creation techniques from the principle of educating people to behave in a particular way or to go to some particular way because we know better from an expert point of view, as you were explaining in the example, Curtiva. And I think this is probably the most difficult part. Well, really accepting that these type of challenges we're talking about, like really we don't know, nobody knows. Right. We all have part of knowledge that can be useful, but really applying that into a process that can better connect the existing portfolio and transform it into an experimentation portfolio. And then we actually seeing this happening in many parts of the world.
Okay, fantastic, Gorka. So let's move on then to two people who might have some of the answers or hints at the answers, because let's bring in Nat now, Nat Whally from Organise, because Nat's in effect building a social business built on people listening to people, allowing people to listen to one another and then claim a voice in taking action about how they're employed. So Nat, just tell us a bit about Organise and what you do and how you've built new relationships amongst workers to enable them to have greater confidence in trying to shape their conditions of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Charlie. So yeah, Organise, I mean, the fundamental kind of principle that we're building Organise on is that collective action can create better working conditions and working patterns for workers. But the problem we're trying to solve is the fact that there were models of doing that. So, for example, trade unionship, very successful in the 1900s. But the future of work is changing. As we know, office jobs are now living room jobs. There's the rise of the gig economy. People's relationship with work and their relationship with people they work with is very fragmented. And that makes people quite powerless. And it's very difficult to know if your problems are shared problems. You know, are you going through this on your own? So that's the kind of problem we're grappling with. And it's really hard to build power, and that's what we're trying to do here, right? Build collective power and drive systemic change without those relationships. So our mission as a company is to give workers the tools, the network, and the confidence to improve their lives at work. And those three kind of really work together. You can't have one on their own. It won't work. So thinking about opening up that box in terms of like how you build a network for workers in the 21st century, we've been thinking very much about like how you build relationships and what that looks like and the architecture of those relationships. So traditionally, we have an online network where we now have, I think, 1.5 million workers, primarily in the UK. And when you think about online networks, people often think about social networks. So it's built on a graph of who you know. So whether that's LinkedIn or Facebook, you know, TikTok, it's all about who you know. And then there are also networks that are quite local, built on local graphs. So things like nextdoor.com, if you're familiar with that, it's built on who you are geographically close to. What we're doing is building a network on top of a worker graph. So when anyone joins our network, we're capturing their employment status. So they're able to relate people who are also self-employed or also employed or also unpaid carers, that sort of thing, their sector and their industry, so people in a similar space to them. And then thirdly, either their employer, if they're employed, or their profession, if they're self-employed or in some kind of other employment. And so those three sort of ways of thinking about the worker graph, so the ways you could hold relationships in that space, is the foundation of the network and the way we think about how we build power. And so that's what we've really focused on kind of reframing. I'm really conscious that that's very abstract, so it might be helpful to talk through a specific example.
Yeah, let's do that. But basically, you're providing workers with a new way of understanding themselves and their relationship to other people, so they can find new common cause. Oh, actually, I thought I was the only person who had their shift changed at 4 hours notice, but actually there are 40,000 people who that's happened to. So give us a practical example of how Organise worked and thought about change.
So I'm sure pretty much everyone on this call understands this problem. So we have a ton of Amazon delivery drivers on Organise. So the way Amazon commissions them, they're not directly employed by Amazon. So they don't have an employer-employee relationship. They're often employed through things called DSP, which are like delivery service partners. So they're very fragmented. They often don't know other workers who might be doing very similar delivery routes to them, but they might be employed by different employers, so they're different DSPs. And so what Organise does is, in that instance, we run big national campaigns that bring people into our network. And then obviously we've mapped them by their employment status, their profession, so that we know that they are delivery drivers for Amazon. They can all talk to each other. Also very important to say this is all pseudonymous, so no one is able to be identified, which is a very important principle in terms of how we build power. So looking through the lens of I think it was 5 things in relationships, so like opening up the boundaries and changing that regional architecture. So the Amazon drivers, basically one of them was noticing that the amount of deliveries they were doing each shift was going up, like ratcheting up up every week. So they're having to do more and more stuff for the same pay, to the point that it was getting quite dangerous. So like people were involved in accidents, they were working 14, 15-hour shifts because there were no regulations around the cap on driving if you're self-employed. And so they started with a survey, so using one of the tools that Organise offers to map the scale of the problem. So then they're not just asking people at their DSP, but they're asking Amazon drivers, anyone who said they're an Amazon driver in the UK, what's it like for you right now? And then they're finding shared experiences. Obviously, they're all seeing their targets ratchet up week by week. And then that's hugely validating for you as an individual in terms of building your confidence. It's like, oh, I'm not on my own. This is not just me. And then thinking through in the turning vicious negative cycles into positive ones framing, they're then crowdsourcing solutions. So it's not just about lowering the targets, but they also wanted to change how they load their vans, like how they stagger those times, because sometimes they're waiting half an hour to be able to load their van. They all know this because they're all experiencing it, but no one's aggregating that data. So it's giving the workers the power to aggregate that data and then propose solutions. So rather than it just being a like stop our targets, it's actually a positive framing. And then in terms of rebalancing the power, traditionally the delivery service partners, the DSPs, negotiate with Amazon for the routes. Basically, they weren't getting any purchase by asking their DSPs to lower the targets, so they went around this. So all of a sudden, you've got sort of 5,000 Amazon drivers taking their demands directly to the person who is commissioning the work. So that's rebalancing the power and the purpose of the system. And then finally, the piece in the relationship 5 steps, the enhanced learning through data sharing. Amazon themselves as a company, they collect a lot of data, but they very intentionally don't collect data about how long a route takes because they don't want to know that it takes 15 hours, right? Because they know that's pretty dodgy. But by surfacing and collecting that data and taking that to Amazon, it's enhancing their context. They can't ignore it because it's like, oh, yeah, you've mapped it. You're not wrong. And so by doing that, they saw their targets drop by like nearly 20%, which was huge, made their work much more sustainable. And it's obviously ultimately less dangerous for not just like the drivers, but, the people they're delivering to. So that's, I think that's a good example.
Let me just run, that was brilliant, Nat. Let me just run through, bring it back to this model.
Sure.
And then bring Ben in. But it sounds like, in a way, the delivery drivers sort of found themselves over here. They were trapped between a market which they had no power in and authority and hierarchy, which wouldn't give them the time of day. And as a result, they were extremely fragmented. And what you have done, it sounds to me, is sort of create a technology for a network in a way which has sort of created a stronger counterbalancing sense of community. But we can come together to influence this part of the triangle over here. And the way you've done that is, in a way, is, as you say, open up the boundaries, because they were just all separated, weren't they? Completely. They were kept in their separate boxes. So they were all in different sort of subsystems. And you said, well, actually, if we find a way to cut across those DSP subsystems, then we can create new relational architectures out of that. And then what happens when you do that, you create those new relational architectures, is they all start learning. And all the Amazon drivers start learning from one another. And then other workers start learning from them. And then suddenly these people over here who have been kept completely powerless now have acquired the power to learn, which allows them to have more influence on the purpose and power of the system. And as you say, try and prevent negative spirals. I mean, they're trapped in negative spirals over here, aren't they? Of powerlessness, and you're trying to shift the whole system. And in a way, I mean, I suppose at its most optimistic, trying to show Amazon that you could be doing that. I mean, that they could be doing that. I mean, absolutely. And they could be better employers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite a tall ask of Amazon. But I think the exciting thing is that you're building that the network exists beyond that moment. So they felt powerful in that win. And right now, Amazon are trying to cut their pay by £20 a day, which is a huge amount. That's like £100 a week, which we're going through this cost of living crisis. Like it's
their energy bills are going up by £20 a week.
But they've already got the network, and they're already, like, there's 30,000 of them now. They're already speaking to journalists and everything because they've done it before, and they've got those existing relationships and confidence from that first win. And so it kind of persists beyond that immediate moment. And I think that's one of the other powers of the network is, you know, it's been sort of 9 months since they won that fight. And in the interim, they've been doing other actions to support other workers. And then when there's a flare up that they want to respond to, they're ready.
So this is not a fleeting thing when we think about the way that both Janne and Gorka have talked about how you build the basis for long-term change. And this is not a fleeting thing. Absolutely. Ben, I'm going to bring you in now because you've been listening patiently. Your experience has mainly been in the field of humanitarian assistance and aid. How has that conversation sounded to you, and what's resonated to you about what you've learned about when big change is possible and when people bring together networks to, often in times of crisis, to bring about significant change?
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone. I've been listening and really stimulated and writing down huge amounts. So there's such a richness of ideas and insights. I guess I want to share a few messages from my work on humanitarian networks, and quite a lot of people who I've worked with over the years are actually attending today. So I'm really heartened by that. And my first experience was on working on networks for disaster response and resilience, but then I've moved on to look at issues around health, economic empowerment, peace building, and so on. And I think the first thing to say is, no matter how diverse the networks are, how divergent the goals are, and wherever they sit within Charlie's triangle in terms of how they balance hierarchies, markets, and community power, all networks play some recognizable roles. They have some recognizable functions. And this is as true of networks of traditional healers in Senegal and West Africa, who come together regularly by donkey and cart to share their experiences from across the entire country, as it is for huge billion-dollar global public-private alliances like Gavi, who work to bring together public-private capabilities with not-for-profit organizations to drive vaccine access around the world. And we are a number of colleagues, including Sean Lowry, who's in the audience today, first started working on humanitarian response networks in 2005. We were genuinely surprised at how little attention people had paid in the management literature to the strategic development and management of networks. So we started exploring different kinds of networks and the roles that they have in effective change. And we found that they fulfill 6 non-exclusive functions that are really complementary to the approaches that Charlie set out earlier, that regardless of where they sit within Charlie's triangles, all networks play one of more of these 6 functions. So the first is community building, and this is about sustaining the values and standards of a group of individuals or organizations. There might be very similar types of members, and as a result, they can lead to very strong links within the network. Sometimes they can pull together very different kinds of networks. Nat's network on its website has an archetypal community building motto: one person on their own is not enough. Together, we're powerful. So that's a great example of a community network. But the next function that a network performs is filtering. So this is almost like an economic function of providing network members with a way of organizing and structuring what would otherwise be a huge mass of information that is out there in the world. Now, there's really good examples and evidence now emerging of citizen networks during the Ukraine invasion and how they played a really important function. So they've complemented satellite imagery and traditional media and used social media, and they've been crowdsourcing functions which are filtering this information from a range of different sources from citizens to convey the extent of the damage and the impact they're going on citizens. So that's a really good example of a real-time filtering network. Now, amplifying is where you take a private or a complex message and you turn it into a more public or understandable one. It could be about a particular message or idea, or it could be about a two-way process for communication and feedback. So Organise, again, their example of how through their online network, they've exposed harassment, they've won pay rises, they've helped call out bad bosses. That's a great example of an amplifying network. Now, Gorka and some of the work that he's just come back from Colombia and is a little bit jet lagged as a result. But his work on Agua Bonita, a great example where they took the Basque experience of doing development in socially and economically challenging areas and took that approach to Colombia with a focus on how do we strengthen the communities of ex-combatants. So this approach, which is directly taking knowledge and learning from one network and transferring it to another setting. This is really important because it's kind of the facilitation function of networks. It enables members to acquire new knowledge and develop practical abilities. Now, the next function is around investing and providing. It provides a channel for members to get resources they need. So Charlie mentioned DEC earlier. This is a classic example of an investor network. It's joint fundraising for crises by the major UK NGOs. Now, Sean Lowry, who I mentioned earlier, he actually set up and built another network called Start Network that would do exactly the same thing, but not just for the big emergencies that the DSC works on, but for the smaller forgotten emergencies. And they're still going strong today. And in fact, I think they are mounting their own response to the Ukraine crisis. And the final network, type of network, is around convening collective action. And these are about bringing people together from different kinds of organizations, different kinds of functions. Think about how Charlie talked about Curitiba and how they shifted the boundaries around who was a builder, who was a designer, who was an investor. Think about Janne's work with the Frontrunner Network, applying a holistic approach to civic cooperation and bringing municipalities together with citizens and the private sector. So that convening network is really important as well, that kind of convening for collective action. So what I found by looking at disaster response networks, and actually a whole range of others, private sector, health, and so on, is that you can use these functional analyses to strengthen strategic management of what networks do and why. You can understand what shape, what a new network should do to affect change. You can confirm or rethink or reshape the work of an existing network. You can move from vision to mission to concrete activities, and you can use it to map your existing activities. And this strategic process is often underpowered in networks, in my opinion, because that kind of wider systemic change purpose, somehow it kind of infiltrates the networks and it becomes much more about the purpose. And I think that doesn't mean that strategy should be left to chance. It's really possible to robustly hone your strategies and sharpen your activities and ultimately improve performance. But I think the really key thing about these functions, so you go from community building to filtering to amplifying to learning to investing to convening, just like any relationships, you can't jump straight to the 25th day. You have to go through the functions. You have to build your network up tight. And I think there's so many kind of skeletons in the graveyard of failed networks, which are where people try to jump very quickly to very sophisticated network functions. And I think you actually have to build trust, build momentum, and build energy over time. And you have to think strategically about how you do so.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. So at that point, those are absolutely brilliant, overlapping, crisscrossing contributions. At this point, I'm going to bring Jenny back, who I hope with Johanna has been looking at all the questions that have been coming through in the Q&A and amongst the participants. Sean is there in the chat saying hello to Ben. Last time I saw Sean, he was on the verge of moving to Vancouver from Lewisham. I hope that's gone well. Jenny, questions?
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you to everybody. So there are lots of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and we've got about just under 200 people joining us online today from countries as wide as Colombia. They've all followed you here, Gorka, and Portugal, Germany, Spain, Slovakia, Finland, Iceland, and the ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people in Canada. And one question that's coming up for people, I think, is how should we think about these relational patterns when we transfer them across contexts? How to what degree can we actually do that? So Jessie has a question here. Don't we need to keep our concepts anchored to their context? What happens if we change that? And Paula is asking a question about where does it become possible to experiment with new types of relationships in places that are where hierarchy and rank play an especially important role, for example, Ethiopia or Nigeria. So maybe Ben and Gorka, perhaps you could take those. So Ben, what have you noticed about transferring those different patterns into different regions globally that you've worked in, and Gorka, how does that work in the Basque country with its deep cultural roots when you're importing ideas from outside? We'll take Ben first.
Thanks. So again, speaking predominantly in the disaster response world, we actually had a whole raft of regional networks that were already emerging in Asia, across Africa, which brought together national and local NGOs. And the framework that we developed was actually used by a number of them to strengthen their own strategic endeavors. Now, on the whole, they actually worked pretty well. There needed to be some kind of cultural adaptation. You needed to make sure that they were relevant. You needed to iterate the tool and make sure that it added value. And importantly, that there was a need that you engage with networks at a point when they have a need to turbocharge their strategic thinking, and they're looking for tools and insights. So I think it's really important you don't go in with a kind of solution, but you ask questions, work out what the right way of going is. And it just happened to be that for the 3 or 4 of the networks, one was called ADRRN, the Asian Disaster Response Network. Another was a newly formed network called the NEAR Network. And we used these frameworks to actually think through, on the one hand, how could the network get better at what it needed to do in terms of strengthening the capability of southern and national and local organizations. And then the other, what should be the priorities of this new network as it was being designed and developed, and how could a story be told? And the approach worked for both initiatives. So I do think, obviously, go in sensitively and pay attention to the dynamics that are ongoing, but you can help craft a more intelligent and strategic conversation. And it can happen across regions.
Great, thank you, Ben. And Gorka, how would you respond to that challenge?
Yes, well, when we started doing this work, this was our main concern, that we were in some ways, trying to share or trying to work. We're now working in more than 10 different countries, just bringing, our own background, and actually what we have discovered is that the core components of system change are the same everywhere. So there are different methods, obviously, and then each space, each community will develop its own form, its own structure. The moment where you actually try to bring a particular form is when it doesn't work. But when you invest in the resources for really listening, what is the identity of that particular challenge? And I think that's really one of the core elements. Like if we are working in Colombia, for example, and we are working with this new communities have been formed after the peace agreement, you can go with your with set of solutions, or you can actually spend more time in listening, not only what is on the surface. What I think is actually what are the drivers that are behind those words in the surface. So what we discover is that there are core components that I think we use different names, and I think these categories that you have been just sharing is actually a fantastic way of describing these core components. So what we see is capabilities for mapping or understanding the system. So how do you actually analyze what's going on there? How do you listen to those cultural dynamics in a specific form? How do we create sense-making opportunities that are not transactional, that are relational and during the whole process? And then how do we move into portfolio of interconnected actions instead of single point solutions? Those core components, in our experience, are everywhere. The problem is in the case of Colombia, what it hasn't worked is when some of our Basque colleagues came saying, no, you need to organize the cooperatives in this way, because this is the way that it has worked in the Basque country. And then obviously it doesn't work. But the idea of collective action, it doesn't matter what kind of legal structure is going to take, it's still there. So either the system generates this capacity for collective action, or it will not be possible to transform the system. So you can, it's been a fascinating journey for us, because we actually have now less problems to work in Pakistan or in Uruguay now than actually in the Basque Country, because it is not anymore, a problem with an approach problem. Is a problem of actually which kind of methods to use, and there is a confusion between a method and an approach. So I think if we could clarify that, is normally really useful. Thanks.
That's very helpful, Gorka. Thank you. That distinction between methods and approaches. And just building on that, there's a question in the chat from Ilias, who is curious about what it is that what it is you think it's important to notice about when the system is changing or needs another round of spaces to renew the relational architecture. So what is it that you're looking out for that is the sort of signal that that you need to then look again at that relational architecture? And Gorka, maybe you could just speak to that, and then Janne, maybe we'll go to you. So Gorka, what is it that you're noticing, I guess, when you've got that listening system going across all of the stakeholders?
Sorry, apologies. I thought that was speak before. So what we see in those moments of deliberation or in deep listening, what we see emerging are kind of opportunities that connect with the different ways of understanding that reality naturally. So that there is that kind of need to get things connected normally emerge naturally when we wait, when we are not, I think it was Ben as well who mentioned this kind of when you try to jump too fast into a particular technical solution. So that capacity to see those connections emerging and then moving very rapidly into action, into experimentation, it's been the most interesting part. Obviously, the governance models, the governance systems that need to happen to navigate that complexity is the most difficult part. In our experience, the most challenging is being the relational part. So actually, how so in terms of these big or larger scale interventions, they don't fail because of the normally the resources or because the technical problems, but actually in the way to navigate the human dimension of that of those platforms and networks. So we are back into, I think, the relational aspect that you were mentioning. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gorka. And Janne, I think this is probably all very familiar to you, because although you're not working in different countries, you are working in 7 very different municipalities. And so how is it that between that network, you're doing that work of sense making and collecting and noticing the things that are important to know about the changes and how they're being successful?
Yeah, let's see if I can answer that. We're fortunate here because we have so many people working out of good intentions and working for the purpose of helping people that need their help. But what we see is that people don't recover whatever they need to recover from all these good intentions and this whole system. So if we look at the meeting between the municipality and the citizen, we need a power switch there. It speaks well into this model with the hierarchy and that, and the workers of the municipality and all the people in general that wants to help, they need to take off the you could say the cap of control and empower the person they're there to help. And that we've known that for a long time now and tried to do that. and it just didn't happen in a big scale. So what we do is to take that to the next level and say the community policy needs to take off the cap of control and give it to the social worker that works with the citizen to empower them, to make them able to empower the person they're there to help. And that wasn't enough either. So now what we're trying to do is to make the government, the national level, try to take off the cap of control and empower the community policy and all the other stakeholders in the field, so we can all together in our relations empower each other and empower the layers. And so it's all about empowerment, basically. And how do we get there? We get there by trust and by putting in ideas instead of just pinpointing what's wrong in the system, and try to put in ideas of new constructions of implementing legislations, for instance, and so on and so on. So try to come up with ideas that we can try out together instead of just criticizing, basically. And then, yeah, back to all the relations and the coffee drinking and the, yeah, making purpose. Yeah.
Thank you, Janne. And there was lots of questions in the chat about the role of storytelling as well. So how is it that we use storytelling to remind ourselves of the sort of collective processes that embed change as we go along? And Nat, there's a lot of interest in how it is that you managed to enact that change with the Amazon drivers. So the audience is curious to know how it was that happened or started. And then I'd also like to ask you a bit about what it feels like from your end developing a new kind of system, if you like, in amongst the systems that are already there. And what's that process like for you to sort of be entering into that kind of territory? Have you found yourselves making big changes along the way? Did you go in with a sort of intention that you've had to shift? How has it played out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the Amazon one because that one's easier. So yeah, the campaign itself, like the idea came about from, we run every month, I think it is, or every few weeks, a survey that's super open field questions. So it's asking 10% of the members within our network, what's work like for you this week? And so that's looking for patterns in those answers, and then workers are able to see that and spot that they have shared experiences, which gives them the confidence to then create their own surveys. So all the content is built by the workers themselves, so it's in their language. They often run things that I have no idea what they mean. So they'll call for a change, and I'm like, I literally don't understand that, but good luck. And that's what makes it super exciting. But in terms of like, Janne, your phrase of take off the cap of control, we've thrown the cap. The cap's miles away. And that's risky. And then that kind of leads me on to the, and then yeah, in terms of how we won the Amazon campaign, the workers know what Amazon does, how it operates, and what crucially like the theory of change should be to win that campaign. They knew that Amazon were very scared of being investigated for this like breach of sort of length of time, how long they drive for. If they're driving for 15 hours a day, they know that Amazon are terrified about that being exposed or investigated by the authorities. So their sort of threat to Amazon when they were asking for the change was very much like, we will take this to Parliament. We'd like to run an investigation in Parliament if we don't get some kind of redress. But they understood that, and it's the workers themselves who know the realities of what's actually like what their managers are worried about, and that's something that we'd never been able to know as we're not inside the system. And so I think there's something about like being inside the system, having a real understanding of like the levers of power. Then in terms of Organise itself, it's been a wild ride. I think changing the system itself, one of the biggest like challenges we had early days, for context, me and Jenny did some work early doors. Jenny was a mentor on an accelerator I went through, which was super helpful. One of the challenges was around thinking about how we measure impact, for example, like how do we know we're being successful? When the lens of impact is generally looked at like you have something you're trying to achieve, but we have a structure we're trying to change, which is much harder to measure. And we kept trying to fit ourselves into the box of like, how many beneficiaries are we going to help, for example? And actually that very much depends on like the change that the members of the network are trying to enact, which is really hard to know what's a sensible place to aim at. And if someone's running something that has a big national impact, so for example a big law change nationally, that has a huge number of beneficiaries coming out of that. But we also have campaigns that change workplaces that have 20 people in, and both can take a similar amount of resource, and that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, when you're trying to change something that systemic, is how do you measure and sort of benchmark yourself on impact, was one of the biggest challenges. And then secondly, coming into a space where there are quite entrenched powers was quite difficult. I think we found that quite tricky. Originally, we found quite a lot of difficult relationships with trade unions who had a lot of power in this space. And I think the tipping point for me was so we've been going nearly 5 years, our 5th birthday is this month. About a year ago, a trade union who'd originally tried to sort of blacklist us from some of the trade union spaces came back and wanted to partner with us. And I think it's the classic thing of first they're scared of you, and then they start to realise there's opportunity, and now actually we've got a really good working relationship. But it was quite uncomfortable getting going, I think, when you're being disruptive in a space where there's entrenched power.
Excellent, Nat. That gives us such a clear picture of how you're manoeuvring in that space and the dilemmas that you have to navigate as you're doing that. And I liked your point earlier about how you benchmark yourselves when you're operating at such different scales. And that's actually a question that Jane has about how we can think about interactions across the spectrum. So if we're looking at single bounded systems, and then we're also looking at large scale movements of change and ecosystems, how is it that we can think about the interactions that happen between those single systems and those larger scale ecosystems? And Ben, maybe I come to you on that one. And I know you were keen to also come back on that question of noticing across a system.
Was that for me?
It was for you.
Sorry. I want to talk a little bit about how to track the contribution of networks, actually, before we get on to that, because it's a really important point, and it's something that we all struggle with. And there's a network scholar called Laszlo Barabazi, who's probably done more to understand, help us understand what networks are and how they operate and functions. And he has this wonderful phrase that performance drives success, but when you can't directly measure performance, networks drive success. So do as much as you can to track the health and the strength of the network. So I talked about Gavi earlier, and they quite often in their country settings, they're talking about the delivery of vaccines, but they, as we well know, vaccine delivery is a highly politicized, highly socialized, highly enculturated process. And they use social network analysis to really understand how the social architecture supports the vaccine delivery process. They've used it in a whole range of different settings, and to understand the linkages and the pathways of stakeholders who can influence critical decisions towards vaccine take-up. In my own sector, and those of you who work in disaster response, you will know that disaster responders tend to be a rather surly, insular bunch, and they're not given really to collaboration and engagement. The kind of top line is, why should we collaborate? That's only going to slow us down. It doesn't save lives. But actually, analysis that we've done on social networks of disaster responders consistently find that the most lives are saved by those organizations that are most central to the network. The name was Laszlo Barabazi. And obviously, we know about the power of networks in business. One of the best network indicators of network success I've come across in my career was the traditional healers network I mentioned earlier on in Senegal. And all the members would travel, but partly because of tradition, that they would travel by donkey and cart to the headquarters in Fatick in the center of the country. And the rotating chairs of the network told me they could judge the health of the network by the rather wonderful indicator of the amount of donkey dung that was accumulated outside the compound. The more donkey feces there was, the more people there were, the more carts there were, the more active the network was. And so they'd look out and go, well, the network's doing well at the moment. So there are lots of proxies that I think we need to start applying, especially when we're thinking about network success for social change, when that social change is for a systemic change that we can't necessarily track and we don't know what it's going to look like in the future. That said, I do think that, and I want to go back to Charlie's point here, networks for systems change are about articulating and exercising strategic choices between actors that have very different values. So if you think about climate change, as in the paper that's just been shared by Keith Grint, climate change has got three strong arguments going on at the moment, including the anti-climate change. But in terms of how to deal with it, there's the market response. Technical innovations will help address global warming at every level. There's the hierarchical response. Stronger global regulation of carbon emissions is what we need, and we need it now. And then there's the kind of community and mutuality response. There's changes in our individual consumption patterns and a more socially just way of working that's going to lead to addressing climate change. Now, each one of those solutions is elegant, but they're also imperfect and incomplete. And so a network that's trying to actually drive climate change solutions, part of the value of that network needs to be determined in terms of how well it's negotiating those interests. The power of and the intensity of that negotiation is really important. And the best networkers kind of undertake bricolage. They don't just open up the space for change, but they politically and technically remix the solutions, and they hold the space for the messiness of systems change to happen, for it to actually the new kind of system to emerge. And I think that for me is one of the best ways of noticing whether or not your network is successful. Are your negotiations intense? Are they burning you up? Are they, because they should be if you're getting close to systems change, because you're getting close to the changing the architecture of power.
Great, thank you, Ben. So are the negotiations intense, and are we producing enough dung from our networks as we go along? Thank you. Charlie, back to you. What's been going on in your mind as you've been listening to our panel?
Great. I think it's been a brilliant discussion which could go on for quite a long period of time. It's been very rich. I suppose one thing that I've been thinking about is the delicacy of the relationship between these things, that you have to convene for collective action, but if you move too fast, too quickly to a goal, then people distrust you. If it's too expert driven, they distrust you. It's got to be bottom up. And so you need to build this sense of shared identity and share information to build learning, and then maybe through amplification and investment you get to change. So what interests me is how you go from convening to action, really, and authentic, collaborative, collective action. Because I know quite a lot of people who are very good at convening, but I don't know a lot of people who are very good at convening and then taking collaborative action. That's what really interests me. And so what really interests me, I mean, I think this is a very good list. And what really interests me about Nat and what Nat is doing, what Organise have done, is just how quickly they accelerate the cycle of listening, of giving voice, of experimenting, of bringing out new relationships. And so we've talked in the past on these podcasts of these sessions of this that change that just goes like that. Here's where we are, here's our goal. That doesn't work for a lot of these complex problems. It's too instrumental, too directional. But when you look at the history of a lot of systems change, it kind of looks like this. I mean, it's too long, it's too meandering. And so what we've talked about is this process of intentional emergence, where you're constantly trying to learn, but also amplify what you're doing, take on bigger goals. And when you think about what Organise has been doing, it's the accelerated learning to generate collective action and collective capacity, which I think is really interesting in what Nat has managed to do. When you compare it with the long slog of what Janne is trying to do, or the long cultural change process. So I'm really interested in what we can learn about how you can create this relational change, which is authentic and rooted and does all the things that Gorka and Ben have talked about. But can you find ways to accelerate that? Because we don't have that long, and that I think is the real challenge. But I think that many of the insights come at this from different points of view, but lead to similar sorts of thoughts. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed to everyone who's taken part in it.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So all that really remains for me to do is to thank all of our incredible guests for your wisdom and your generosity in joining us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. And to you, our audience, for your incredible participation, lots of action on the chat. And I hope that we can continue the conversation. You can tweet at #systeminnovation.org. And all that remains, I'd just like to say thank you to Cecil, who creates all of our artwork. We couldn't do it without her. And we've got the next in the series coming up in a few weeks' time, which is looking at how we rechannel and redirect resources and the flow of resources and systems. We're always really keen to hear from you. So if you have further thoughts or suggestions on the article, please get in touch, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, everybody.